Well, if you guys thought that content is king, I can tell you software is a kingdom, right? We have two trailblazers here from that place which sits behind everything what we are doing today, right? Those glamorous startups, those automation that's happening in the world, these are the guys who are actually building that software, millions of lines of code behind it. Edith and Steve. So my first question to you, Steve, is where do you see this whole process going of making software? How has it changed dramatically in the last 5 years?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just kind of roll backwards a little bit. I mean, I think if you look back to, the 1980s, 1970s, everything was really waterfall development. In fact, through the 90s. If you look, the Agile Manifesto was published in 2001, and that really started a revolution in terms of how people develop software. And it started breaking down the barriers. The business working with the developers, working with the requirements teams, and actually developing software more quickly and developing software that better met the needs of the business. But what people found, and this started to be at the 2008, 2009, people realized that even though they could develop software faster, there was a lot of bottlenecks after you developed the code downstream and getting it deployed, getting it tested. And that's really where DevOps has emerged. So the DevOps term was coined in 2008 at Agile 2008, first DevOps days in 2009. And that really starts focusing on how do you break down some of those bottlenecks after developers check in the code. And I think that's really where the movement is now, and that's sort of where people are in sort of the software development methodology.
And Edith, LaunchDarkly was recently named a cool vendor, right, in DevOps technology by Gartner.
Yes.
What does it mean to be cool?
Well, so I remember the times that Steve just talked about when software was a lot more painful, and I co-founded LaunchDarkly to address a lot of those issues. I have some patents on deployment because it used to be more of a challenge, and it was something that you did very rarely. Like I remember the days where you would release once every year or so.
Exactly.
Now, the business is demanding that you release, if not at least every month. Some people who use LaunchDarkly are releasing multiple times a day. And to me, that's pretty cool, is that we're serving billions of features every day to help people move faster.
So since you're serving billions of people every day to move faster, I asked the question to Steve as well. I mean, I always think, what's next? Because the pace at which the software development is changing is amazing. So how do you keep up with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things is just being able to change quickly and able to adapt. You can't necessarily predict where the market's going to go, but your ability to change is going to dictate your survival. As Charles Darwin said, it's not the strongest or the most intelligent that survives, it's that's most able to adapt to change. And when we talk about deployment frequency, you look at Amazon, for example. On average, they deploy software every 11.7 seconds. And if you look at digital disruption out there, I mean, it's rampant, and really software is eating the world. If the quote from Mark Andreessen, and it's true if you look across every industry. So you look at, Amazon and Alibaba in retail, you look at Uber and Didi and what they've done, you look at Apple with music, and it's all technology and software-powered disruption. And as a large organization, if you're an enterprise, you have to be able to adapt to that change. You've got great ideas, but how can you adapt and deliver some innovation out there to compete and address some of these disruptive threats? As a startup, you have to move fast and you want to come in and you actually want to disrupt some of these companies. But the ability to actually deploy your software-powered, your technology-powered innovation is the most important thing, being able to be flexible and adaptable.
And I think flexible and adaptable in a way that is still evolving. It used to be 10 years ago, like Microsoft would ship out a disk, and the software you got was the same as everybody else's. Now with the move to the cloud, and as Steve said, the ability to quicker deploy, everybody can suddenly have one-on-one software that's customized and personalized for them, and is constantly updating and changing in a powerful way. Like I talked earlier today to a startup here where they said their customers demanded that they update at least once a week, and I think that's going to continue to accelerate.
I think both of you mentioned startups, and that's what we have been discussing backstage as well. Because there are a lot of startups here, and what the challenge for them is what exactly do they outsource? Because then how much they keep inside, and that's kind of the balance that you have to maintain. What's your take on that?
I think the key to being a successful startup is deciding the one, and I say very carefully, one thing that you do better than everybody else.
Your core competency.
And outsource everything else. And where I see startups getting a little bit lost is when they decide to either build everything or they decide to outsource everything. When really what you should need to say is, I am going to be the best at, for example, the best mobile app for hailing a taxi. Do that. Do nothing else.
Yeah. No, I think that's a key point, and I think Martin Fowler said it. When you look at software, you have to look at what is strategic for you to develop, and then you have to look at utility software. And I think one of the places that many software companies spend a lot of time on is actually developing tools. So why spend a lot of time developing tools when you can kind of get that off the shelf and focus on the software that drives your business, that is sort of the core competency and the unique differentiator?
Yeah, I think all engineers start off as being kind of young and thinking that they should build everything because they can. And then as you get older, you realize that just because I can build this, I don't want to. Like one of my engineering projects was I had to make a screwdriver from scratch. And after making a screwdriver from scratch, I'm perfectly happy to go to the hardware store and buy it off the shelf.
Absolutely.
And many people are doing that now. I mean, I think people in startups are moving quickly over to smart management of which software to build and what to outsource, and that's a key for survival for a lot of startups. But Steve, you've talked a lot about how the automotive industry, it's leading much of the innovation into this whole IoT thing. Do you think that's where a lot of software development will happen? In just about the next 12 months to 24-month cycle?
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. A lot of times when you think of DevOps, you think of big web applications, and you think of the Amazons, or you think of a banking application. But DevOps is very relevant in embedded software as well. And again, software is a primary differentiator across all verticals. So you can look at automotive, you can look at aerospace, you can look at medical device. The amount of lines of code in some of these applications is pretty phenomenal. And people will say you can't do DevOps there, but we're working with a number of companies in the embedded sector, and what they're able to do is provide emulators and simulators so you can actually do some testing on the fly and actually be much more responsive and get very, very high cycle times. Again, you're not necessarily testing on the ultimate hardware. The hardware can't change at the same rate. But with emulators and simulators, you can certainly do that. So, we're working with companies like SpaceX, Samsung, Huawei, very, very large companies, and they're able to do some astonishing things. And you mentioned automotive, General Motors. These are companies that are adopting DevOps and using some of these newer practices. So it's relevant for everyone.
So I think that's where. Do you think really that's where the world is moving to, where everybody gonna replicate a Tesla in automation?
Well, I think that's certainly where the market's moving. I mean, Mercedes has said that autonomous driving is going to be here, the technology in 2020, and so I think the technology exists. You're looking at a lot of these traditional enterprises building software and innovation centers in Silicon Valley. So a lot of the car companies now have their innovation centers. There was a session here on autonomous driving technology, and a number of Japanese companies there, but they have operations in Silicon Valley. GE, a big traditional industrial company, invested $1 billion to create a software center in San Ramon, just outside of Silicon Valley. And so, for me, the fundamental message is software really is the thing that's powering it. And it's across every industry. So it's not just automotive, it's not just aerospace. Every industry has to be good at software. If you're not good at software and differentiating via technology, you're subject to disruption.
Yeah.
I absolutely wonder what will happen to them who are not doing it till now, because they're going to play catch up, and what will happen to the petroleum industry then. But Edith, what is serverless architecture, and what you need to know about it when you are in the business?
So I actually wrote an article for and I said usually when you say serverless, people kind of move away from you at a party. And serverless is at its simplest the idea that instead of having to buy a server like it was when I started out, and have somebody who hosts it, have somebody who's kind of maintaining it. The idea of serverless is that you don't care where your servers are, you just plug into them, and out comes power. So I compared it to basically the change of, it used to be you had to build a factory next to a river because you needed a water wheel to power it, and now with serverless, you really don't care where your computers are.
Turn on the faucet.
Yeah, turn on the faucet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think serverless is up and coming, and there's certainly a lot of talk about it in terms of being leading edge. I mean, what we see, we work with a lot of Global 2000 enterprises, and at this point, the wave that we're seeing is really microservices and containers being adopted. And if you look at DevOps, and you read the state of DevOps reports, one of the primary predictors of success of someone being a high-performance organization is a loosely coupled architecture. And so microservices are very, very well suited to DevOps because they're designed to do one small, isolated, targeted service with well-defined APIs. And with that, you can theoretically deploy that more quickly without risk of breaking the broader system. And containers are the perfect delivery vehicle for this because they're designed to run one process in isolation with minimal runtime and deployment overhead. So again, you can deploy them much more quickly. If you've got a scalable app that you need to scale up and scale down, the ability to spin up more containers, scale it out, and bring that back down is very important. So that's where we're really seeing companies, and the rise of microservice and container adoption has been pretty phenomenal, and it's really mirrored the rise of DevOps.
So you talk about the state of DevOps, and Electric Cloud was one of the sponsors of the state of DevOps report that came out. Why don't you take us through some of the findings, and then maybe talk about what's the future of DevOps in enterprise?
Yeah, so some of the results were really astonishing. This is a report that's done every year. The primary sponsor of it is Puppet. We sponsored it this past year. I touched on one of the items is that loosely coupled architectures is one of the biggest predictors of success. But the metrics are what's really phenomenal. And if you look at the business metrics, the deployment metrics, high performers that employ more of the DevOps methodologies deploy 46 times more frequently than low performers. There's a 440 times faster lead time for a change. So high-performance organizations can deliver a change in an hour. For a low performer, it's about 2.5 weeks. It's like 96x faster mean time to recovery. So these are pretty astonishing. Now, those are metrics around deployment, how quickly you can respond. But what they've also found is if you look at sort of financial metrics, business objectives, financial and non-financial, organizations with high-performance IT are 2 times more likely to hit their financial and their non-financial metrics. So it has a business impact, a true business impact.
I mean, that's just a stunning statistic. If you think of your competitor releasing every day, when you take 2.5 weeks, that means that they can basically make 50, 60 iterations while you're just waiting for basic change.
Yeah. And, again, I mentioned the Amazon stat where they're doing a deployment every 11.7 seconds. So imagine if you're a retailer, you're a traditional brick and mortar store, you're Walmart. Gap is one of our customers, and you look at what their lead times were. They really have to focus on reducing that cycle time so they can be responsive to some of these larger organizations that do employ these faster release cycle times.
Well, one of the most interesting things we've seen with their own customers is then the changes it makes in the business once they have that flexibility. Because if you go from a mindset of, I need to wait and do a release every month, to I could do it whenever I want, suddenly it's very powerful for them in terms of there's new messaging I could try, there's a new functionality I can build. It really changes the way they approach their own business. It's not just a technology.
Absolutely.
For both of you, I mean, what are the challenges you think now that we are in a stage where, as you said, Amazon deploys at 11.7 seconds. What are the challenges for delivering better software?
I think the biggest challenge is honestly businesses wrapping their head around this. I think engineers love seeing their software out in the world, and sometimes they're the quickest to adopt it. But then the business process change of, okay, I can release every day. How do I break down features? How do I decide what gets into release? How do I decide who gets them? Is actually much more interesting to me than the underlying technology.
Right. Yeah. Very true. I mean, I think that is sort of is a factor. And I think if you really kind of talk about DevOps, it talks about the dev silo and the ops silo. But more broadly than that, it's really biz, dev, sec, ops. It's really breaking down these silos and fostering greater collaboration and communication. And it's interesting, if you look at, one of the acronyms that's used to describe DevOps is CAMS, Culture, Automation, Measurement, and Sharing. And culture comes first and it's important. It's probably the biggest inhibitor to success. And if you look at two organizations, they may both have the same automation technology, but they see different results. Culture is the key, and people who adopt more of this DevOps cultural mentality where you're breaking down the silos, where you have shared responsibility, in some cases cross-functional teams, but at a minimum shared responsibility, not competing objectives. In the past, development would have to deliver faster, operations was focused on uptime. They weren't shared objectives, they were competing. But you want to have a blame-free culture, you want to have empowered teams, you want to have this culture of continuous learning where you can kind of evolve quickly. Organizations that have that, they're going to succeed with the automation technology. And you have to have that first. That's a prerequisite. And that's one of the big mistakes that I see, and that's one of the big inhibitors to success.
I think that's one of the key points that you've made, that how that culture has to be imbibed, right? I mean, that's the challenge for many people right now, and that's the challenge for legacy as well. So where do you both see it going now in terms of the software development? You talked about the past, what had happened. Where is it going in the next 20 years?
I think the biggest change is that software will become more and more of a living organism in terms of, I talked about it before, but we talked about it, if you can't update every hour, what does that mean for the software that you get?
And what does that mean for human lives?
Yeah, I mean, if every time you want some new feature, suddenly it's there and it's customized to you, that's immensely powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I just think the impact on business. There was a stat that I just read. I think it was from the analyst firm IDC. By the end of 2017, 2/3 of CEOs will have digital transformation at the heart of their corporate strategy. So this is not CIOs, this is not CTOs, this is CEOs, and it's saying at the heart of the corporate strategy, not the IT strategy. So again, software is here with us, and it is going to be the driver of business. Everyone has to be very good at it, and it is going to be transformative across everything that we do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add on. I think 15 years ago, there was this notion that you installed a system once and then walked away.
Yeah.
I think the companies that have done that are now getting massively disrupted.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And when you talk about disruption, I think do you expect to see a lot of disruption actually happening from the software makers rather than people who are right there in front? Because you guys are always at the back. You have the backbone of what's happening, as I say, across the world right now. So do you see a lot of disruption happening within your industry as well?
Yeah, well, I think it's across every industry. I mean, I think the pace of change is just phenomenal. And again, I think in the startup world, I mean, we have to move fast. You have to adapt. You have to change every day, based on the market conditions, what you're seeing, what the responses are from some of the competition. There was a study that was done on the S&P 500 and the tenure on the S&P 500. If you go to 1958, the average tenure on the stock market index, the S&P 500, was something like 60 years. In the 1980s, it was 25 years. Today, it's 18 years. And if you roll forward to 2030, it's going to be 10 years. And this is why you see companies like Apple and Google and Amazon that are sort of the market cap leaders. And we're going to continue to see this. And it's relevant for large enterprises, but every startup, it changes so quickly in all the markets that we operate in. I mean, what we do every day, it's always very, very fast-paced.
Edith, last words from you. I mean, do you think that's going to be at the key of disruption in your own industry that's going to hold the key for better software development?
I don't really like the word disruption. I like transformation. I like transformation because it implies that you're becoming a better company or a better person as opposed to toppling over something. But yes, I think that transformation will continue as people continue to want to get smarter, better, build better software for their customers.
And I think to wrap it up, I think this is the place to look out for, because this is what is going to drive all the change that we are seeing around us, from automation to this mobile phone, everything. It's at the heart of it are the makers of software. You two guys are trailblazers. Keep doing the good work.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.